this last 2 days has been wonderful. Listening to AD yesterday reminded me of my first year here at Loughborough in U020 and brought a little twinkle to my eye. And yeah, it was just wonderful. And thank you, Lauren, for organising all of this. I thought I'd start with a little journey for myself, and then we'll jump into the panel stuff. So in 1990, when I came here, I nearly went to Birmingham. But fortunately, when I walked into Victory Hall here, they were playing badminton with feather shuttlecocks. And that was the deciding factor, because when I went to Birmingham, they were playing with plastics, and that was definitely not it. So I arrived here at Loughborough, and to me, it was like a sweetie shop. There was all my sport, there was the degree, and then there was JCs. And, you know, I juggled those three, and I say to students now, you can do 2 of those 3, and you can do them really well. Now, I did all 3, and most of the time this was good, but occasionally the wheels fell off. So sport-wise, I came here, I squeezed into Loughborough's first team, very fortunately. 4 years later, I was UAU champion for a number of years. So the sport was good for me, and I still managed to play internationally. Degree-wise, I think I had a less than conventional route through the degree programme. So biomechanics, maths, physiology was okay. Sociology was a bit of a challenge for me. And Joe Maguire and me didn't always see eye to eye. So year 1, I managed to get 18% in sociology. So I was quite pleased with that. So I had a pass-fail Viva in my first year to see if I could even continue at Loughborough as a student. Anyway, I squeezed through my first Viva. Clyde will remember my second Viva, maybe. So my final year, I was on the borderline first, and I should have had a Viva in maths, but I didn't. I had it in physiology, and Clyde grilled me on the Krebs cycle. And anyway, that one didn't go so well. So I've experienced the tough questioning from Clyde across the years. But then, fortunately, I did my PhD with Fred, and you know, my final Viva as a student, well, that was a bit easier with McNeil Alexander, so that was all good. And then the last part, well, everything else. I've lived on campus pretty much for 36 years. Well, I've lived in halls since I came in 1990, so still warden. And so I think in my bloodstream, as well as AVs, I think there's a bit of purple nasty as well. Anyway, we move on. It was brilliant hearing everything about all the people who influenced us in the 90s. It was such a wonderful time to be here. But in biomechanics, it was very special because of Fred. Fred was our hero, he was our mentor, and everything we've done in biomechanics is down to Fred. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I think it took me 10 years to get a page of a manuscript through Fred without copious red ink all over it. So I think I went and got drunk that first time. I managed to get my first paper through Fred without lots of commentary on it. Secondly, what was the second one I put down here? Oh yeah, we used to talk about PhysSoc. Well, I can tell you, weekly seminars in biomechanics in the school or Friday afternoon grillings with Fred and David Kerwin was pretty tough too. And the grounding we learnt there and everything we learnt there was second to none, and it still runs true now. And then thirdly, Fred, if you ever see Fred with his eyes closed at a conference, he knows your slides back to front. He's listening. And Fred, have you got your memory in your top pocket? Yeah, Fred's memory is in his cards and his pocket. And if Fred at a conference pulled out a card and wrote something down, you knew at the next Friday afternoon you were in for a real grilling on what you'd said. But, you know, really good memories. But I did dig something out. And how to become a successful PhD student. And we won't dwell on much of that there. But all that knowledge and wisdom. And I was chatting to Fred about this yesterday, and he wanted to add one thing. It was about having a good supervisor. Well, I had the best in you, Fred, so thank you. And then, moving on. So the legacy continues, and last night at mine, we managed to pull together a bit of a crowd, and we had a barbecue and just celebrated, and we had a great time just reminiscing and celebrating 50 years of biomechanics. Now, Fred used to also burn the candle at many ends, but he's far more sensible now, so he decided to duck out last night so he could be optimally performing today. So, you know, in the good old days, Fred would have been the last one there and we'd been dragging him away, but yeah, he's more sensible nowadays. But we also had pulled together a little cake, and this was, you know, all the people, Martin's on there, obviously, everybody and I couldn't fit everybody's names on there. And but Fred couldn't make it. So what I've got here, and I'd like you all to give him a round of applause, I've got the last bit of the cake, Fred, to give to you. Because nobody wanted to see Fred's picture, so we got that as a gift to you, Fred. So we could give Fred a huge round of applause. So, I've eaten up far too much time, so anyway, we'll move on. So now to some science.
Okay, can you all hear me, or do I need to put this up to my... we've got the microphone here. No.
Yeah, you need to
It is on, yes, there's two microphones. So, I'm not really going to do the science part yet. I'm going to entertain you because it's biomechanics, and within 5 minutes you'll all be looking on your phones, falling asleep, or actually getting up and walking out. I am not going to convince you that you're all biomechanists like you could be nutritionists, and all of you will probably be very happy about that. So it's a bit of a strange opening slide, but this is from the Two Towers, Lord of the Rings, and we'll see why the connection. First of all, studying human movement, whichever way we do it, but obviously I'm going to pick on biomechanics, is is a wonderful thing. Because what makes animals animals? Why do we need a central nervous system? It's because we move. Here we have the sea squirt. Swims around as a larvae, has a brain, central nervous system. Finds a rock to live, settles down. First thing it does, eats its brain. Guess that's nutrition. And then what it does, it has no brain, and it sits there because it doesn't have to move anymore. The parallels have been drawn between that and academia and getting a chair, but not just by me. But we have this: animals are living creatures, animate to give life. This is going back into Latin stuff. Anima, the breath, the soul. Are we studying, have to be careful on the pronunciation, our souls? No. But we do study feet, which Sharon will do later. It's a little bit pretentious, but, is it the essence of being a human? Or, to quote the great philosopher King Julian, I just like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. So, biomechanics. Bio from life, mechanics, the annoyed applied maths that no one likes doing. What's interesting here is 1680, Borelli, De Motu Animalium. Here's the latest textbook. Yeah, we're cheats. We haven't done anything new in like 400 years, 350, 400 years. Newton's 1687. We are very old and boring type people. However, the mechanics hasn't changed, but the technology has a lot. Like many newish subjects looking to establish itself, let's go back to Lascaux cave paintings, 17,000 years old, where you can see the first biomechanists were clearly trying to produce some slow motion animation of what they were doing in their hunting. However, their formatting was clearly in Word because nothing quite lines up properly, unlike it does in a beautiful picture that we now do with modern technology taken at the Olympics. There are some interesting biomechanists about. I know you listened to Martin Shorten moan on for ages yesterday, so you might not believe that, but there are some interesting biomechanists. Some of them are in this room. One of the key things we had in history was Edward Muybridge, this time early academia, not, but parallels. Stanford, ex-governor of California, future senator, had a $50,000 expenditure on settling a bet. That's millions in today's money. Edward Muybridge developed this method of getting these images, which proved that the horse was galloping. Then went on to a lot of stuff in human analysis, carefully edited pictures here. All his work was done, naked people. In those days, again, the bias was still there. It was mainly male subjects, so that's why we have the male subjects pictured here. But there were some things that a bit different. Muybridge had been convicted, well, charged with murder and convicted, but had it squashed in justifiable circumstances. We have gambling as the funding source for all his work, so there's some intrigue and there's some nudity. Biomechanics might not be quite so interesting today. it's definitely less murdery, we hope, at least. So 73 was when the International Society of Biomechanics was founded. It was founded at Penn State University, and got some clear links here. 72, Peter Kavanagh, Loughborough graduate, came, had a faculty position. So a Loughborough graduate was there when the International Society of Biomechanics was founded. Just behind that sign was my first PhD office. Other people who were there at the time, Carl Newell, again, in Stuart's photos, and then also my supervisor, John Chalice, who had been here under David Kerwin, same time as Fred was about, and Sharon, and he was there as well. So we had this link. And I've put Stuart Biddle there. He was there at one point. He was not a biomechanist. I hope you don't want to pretend either. And there is no picture of Stuart, not because he's not a biomechanist, because if you don't know who Stuart Biddle is, in the terms of gym parlance these days, do you even Loughborough bra? So he needs no introduction. So apparently I've done things wrong. I went to Penn State and then came here. Hopefully it started a new trend. Sam Winter's here. Hopefully there'll be other people in the future. But, that is my confession. I was never a Loughborough student. Get him off. So, biomechanics, what have we been doing all our lives, all this time? Well, we're the basement people. We like dark, dingy labs. You can go to the Harvard Spalding Gate lab. It's in the basement. We are the basement people. We like to control our light. We don't like things too busy. Maybe we don't like other people. But we work in sort of two complementary areas. We sort of do this, one, human experiments, and two, computer simulation modeling. We try to have these two areas and work side by side. We'll see examples of both. So sum up what biomechanics has done over the decades. Can be done very easily. Cine, analog, big screen. Video, small screen. Automated motion analysis systems, big screen. The future, AI, who knows what we're going to be doing, very small screen. So biomechanics, if you want to know the history of biomechanics, big screen, little screen, big screen, little screen. That's all you need to remember. So Cinefilm used to let us roam wild. Video cameras let us roam wild. There's 2000 Olympics. Fred took a team there. He'd been at 88 Olympics, many other events. But the lab stuff, we started getting, how nerdy and technical we can become, and doing things like this. Now this complex stuff, why do we have the two towers at the beginning? Well, one of the interesting biomechanists, Tom van der Bogert, has an Academy Award for his work that he developed that was used in those animations in the two towers and has been used continually since. So that's three interesting biomechanists if you go back 150 years. So some are in the lab, me sticking multiple markers on, Sam Winter sticking multiple markers on, doing clever lab stuff. But we've slowly been reintroducing ourselves back into society. Mark is taking whole laboratories out to places. Stuart, Sam, Glenn have been laying modern technologies and going out, trying new stuff. IMUs rather than cameras, newfangled stuff like it's in your phone, so it must be technologically advanced. And Daniel Fong developing this using video taken from normal broadcast TV to start using some modeling to look at what's happening. And then computer simulation modeling. What we have generally done is had a single model, either subject specific, like we'll see, or a generic average human, which doesn't work for anyone. We've started to work on some small variations of these, small clone versions, and developing better things. And what we eventually want to go to is doing real diverse populations. To do real diverse populations, you also need real diverse data. So we're going to have to really get back out there into the community and do stuff. And again, animation based on stuff developed by biomechanists in these movies, which is the interesting part. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm told we do need to use the mic, so you're going to be in trouble. I think it's important that I start off with outlining my links to Loughborough. I first did my undergraduate here, 86 to 89, and it feels like a little gap that's not been covered. I was just speaking to some of the now colleagues who would have taught me then. The degree was physical education, sports science and mathematics. So physical education was still there through the 80s as a really important part. It meant that I experienced things I wouldn't have done. I came to Loughborough as a footballer, which was quite unusual at the time, and a runner. So I might be able to supersede Mark's 18% by having the record of coming bottom in class in dance in both my first year and my second year. It didn't put me off. I completed my degree, and I wouldn't have even considered a PhD. I had no idea what a PhD was at that time. I was really lucky and worked for 1 year at the British Olympic Medical Centre as a physiologist. Not quite sure how I managed that. Maybe the Loughborough name made a difference. Brilliant experience. But I wasn't really a physiologist. I was much more mathematical in terms of applied mechanics. And I then went into engineering, got really good experience in engineering, and possibly the best thing that ever happened to me was I got made redundant after a couple of years, and so contacted the small number of universities that I was aware of that were doing research in biomechanics. And I ended up coming in George Gandy's words, back home to Loughborough. And I very much feel like that's the case. Finishing my PhD in 96, I did a couple of postdocs, one out in Calgary, one at the University of Nottingham, and then I've worked at the University of Exeter since 1999. So I have a strong Loughborough background, but quite a little while ago. Come back regularly, collaborate, especially with people in the engineering field, but it's really nice to be here. So thank you ever so much for giving me this opportunity, primarily with this title I've been given, to celebrate 50 years of running gait biomechanics and injury progress, if you like. I'm told that introduction doesn't count to my 8 minutes, by the way. So actually, I'll go back briefly, because I had a couple of pictures there, didn't I? So, running boom, 1970s. There was apparently a running boom. I can't remember that. I was around, but I don't recall it. White, thin male runners. 50 years later, we have a much bigger running boom. Many more people out there running, much more diverse population. And these runners, well, as well as being diverse, have access to a lot more technology, a lot more guidance, some of it good, some of it less good. And one of the things they have access to is gait analysis. They can go into a running shop, as I did here, and as long as you buy a pair of shoes, this is a free service, and we can see lots of numbers on there. Those numbers are claiming to represent the angles of the different joints when viewed from behind. As a result of those joint angle measurements, you get sent an email with this video and with some guidance on areas that you perhaps have weakness, and you get some information on perhaps muscle groups that you could train, focus on to improve your balance, your performance, and potentially reduce your chances of getting injury. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is consider what developments have taken place over the last 50 years, contributing to us getting to this point, and also what approaches have been taken to understand aspects of gait that might influence the risk of injury and potentially inform the management of that injury. So here's the biomechanics lab when I first came back. Didn't change much until quite recently, I gather. And you'll see in a later slide of mine, the approach is still unchanged, really. We're looking at quantifying with a force platform. That is me, I'm afraid, I have to confess. It was my hairstyle then. force plate, cine camera. Collecting both of those after the data collection, looking with lighting systems at synchronizing that information. The bottom left, I took the liberty of taking, and I will acknowledge it, so I'm not plagiarizing Martin. This is from Martin's PhD. So we would have a two-dimensional, in that case, sagittal view of the running gate. And then Peter Kavanagh, who's already been acknowledged at length in terms of Loughborough links, published a really nice paper about profiling of runners. Biomechanical profiling of elite distance runners. Male, of course. So we get information, perhaps one of the most interesting at the time being the amount of rear foot movement, the term we use, pronation, one of the things that is measured quite a lot. And we also have force platform data being used to help determine and categorize runners. And we heard yesterday from Martin how perhaps this isn't the most appropriate way of doing things, but at the time and still now, many people would classify themselves as a different type of runner. And we also have technologies that at that time were being developed to measure the distribution of the force, the pressure under the foot. So the technologies that were being used then were being applied primarily to characterize the style of running. Any links with injury at that point will have been speculative. As we move through time, we start to see reports in the literature where rear foot movement in particular, the amount of pronation, was linked to injury. And this was based on clinical observations. So runners attending injury clinics with things such as Achilles tendinopathy, shin pain, and a recognition that a relatively or disproportionate number of those runners demonstrated a high amount of pronation, a high amount of rolling in of their rear foot. There was a sign in our biomechanics lab, by the way, saying I would rather be digitizing, because this was the process that we got these angles. Dots to represent the leg, and in this case the back of the shoe, to give us our angle, frame by frame. A lot of you will be familiar with that practice at the time of digitizing. So the associations with injury were based primarily on clinical observation at this point, but these were reported in the literature. So we start to see a level of evidence. Beyond that, we move through to get retrospective studies that compared injury groups with injury-free groups. I'll stay with the most common example in terms of movement, that being peak pronation. A couple of examples there from the literature where a group of runners who had recently had a certain injury, their level in biomechanics was compared to a group who had been running as well and were injury-free. One of the examples from work that I've been involved with, looking at military population, also demonstrating characteristics of this rear foot movement being different in a group, in this case, who experienced third metatarsal stress fracture. And in this case, the timing was such that the peak angle occurred earlier in injury group. A nice example of why this retrospective approach may not be ideal is provided here. So this is looking at a plantar pressure study. The images on the left demonstrate the approach, the study itself being by Queen and co-authors, where these authors demonstrated when they compared individuals who had metatarsal stress fractures and those who hadn't, they found a reduction in forefoot pressure in the injury group. Their suggestion or interpretation of this was that this observation was a result of compensation to reduce the load on a previously injured area. So it's highlighting the challenge with this retrospective approach in terms of us not being clear whether our observations are a result or a cause of the injury or an effect of that injury. These studies also tended to be relatively small group sizes, and measurements were generally being taken externally. We've got motion, we've got pressure and force under the foot. We don't know what's happening in terms of injured structures. So a way in biomechanics we can start thinking about internal loading is to utilise joint moments. And I wanted to acknowledge the work of Alexander and Vernon here because of the relatively early application of this approach, not as early as described by Matt, clearly, but early in terms of applying it to running, understanding runners. These authors would have used cinefilm. So the picture on the left has been traced from one frame of cinefilm movement, and the cross is marked to represent joint centres. That force vector on there, and it describes in the text, has been drawn on to approximate where it acts. So that will have a large effect, a large potential error, resulting in large error, as highlighted by the authors, on the resultant moments. But we still start to understand the contribution of the different joints. More commonly now, what we would do is collect that force plate and motion data synchronized at the time, so that we can then speed up that process and, as long as we calibrate well, make it more accurate. So a nice example of applying this approach in injury work on biomechanics, it's described by Darren Stefanishin from Calgary, where he utilised the moment about the knee in the frontal plane to approximate the loading at the knee and compared patellofemoral pain runners with controls. But this was done in a prospective way. This meant that he needed a large group of runners at the beginning of the training period, collected data for 140 runners at the start of the training period, then monitored them over time, identified 6 with injury, and was able to compare the biomechanics, in particular aspects of that moment and loading. But limited in terms of, with running studies, we're not clear what the runners have been doing. We can ask them, but we don't have a control over their exposure to risk. I've been really lucky to work with military populations where we have potentially more control over that exposure to risk. We know they're all doing the same training. So I've been working with the Royal Marines for a number of years. We can collect biomechanical data at the start of their 30-week training and monitor them over time. The first study looked at over 1,000 recruits, and we identified differences in aspects of biomechanics, including differences in pressure and movement. But this is limited because it's external still. We're looking externally. So I'd like to finish by just mentioning a couple of studies that we're continuing to do that are prospective in nature. One looking at internal loadings, and this is a nice Loughborough connection. Hannah Rice is an undergraduate student from here who did the same degree as myself, but 10 years later developed a model to estimate stress, bending stress on the tibia. We're able to apply that with our military populations now. So we can collect data at baseline, at the start of training, and see whether there are characteristics of lower limb biomechanics in running that mean that some individuals are experiencing greater stress, in particular in this case of the tibia. You'll note that we've got data here for over 1,000 Royal Marine recruits, but we're only able to look at the biomechanics of 300. This is because it takes a really long time with marker-based data collection. The Loughborough connection here, this work is being led by Dr. Jo Fallowfield from the Institute of Naval Medicine, who did her PhD with Clyde at the same time as I did mine. It takes a long time to collect the data though. Technology developments that Matt's kindly mentioned already allow us to collect data without markers, so increasingly we can collect that data. We've started a study, again a Loughborough connection. This is led by Professor James Bilson from University of Bath, where we're collecting data aiming to get 1,000 Army trainees. We anticipate, because we're using markerless motion capture, it's not time consuming, we only need a few minutes per person, we can collect data biomechanically from all of those individuals and track injury cases. So I've followed through on developments in data collection methods through to the current day, and also the different methods that are used to do those studies, finishing with, in tradition of the previous session's presentation of utilising your children in your presentations. This is my 2 daughters running on the treadmill. I'm not sure I could have the confidence to identify whether one is more likely to get injured than the other at this point, solely based on their low limb biomechanics, but the evidence base is growing to help if someone is injured. And some of that is because it's more than just biomechanics, isn't it? There are lots of things, and the work that we're doing both with the Navy populations and the Army is not just focused on biomechanics. And to finish, a lovely picture from doing my PhD. Hopefully you recognise a few faces. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. It's my great pleasure to talk to Fred.
My name is Fred. It's not really, but we don't have time for that. I'll just take my solid state memory out because this talk's been getting longer the longer I've been sitting there. First of all, after Matt's example of not being here, I thought I'd better mention my long-standing Loughborough credentials. I was a Loughborough summer school student here in 1970. Another thing I should say is I'm trying to give sufficient volume or appropriate volume, but I do respond to surreptitious hand signals while the talk is going on in case you can't hear me. My solid state memory is here because my supervisor John Arthur told me that if you're making a presentation, Fred, write down your introduction and write down your conclusion and read them out so that at least you get those right. And if I may add my own advice to that, if you screw up in between those two things, do not tell anybody because that's all they'll remember from your presentation. Okay. My hope educationally is that everyone will learn something new from the presentation, and I will read this. My presentation style may be characterized by using a Mad Magazine paraphrase of a Reader's Digest section, namely, towards more pictures and less speech. Finally, in this whirlwind presentation on simulation and sports technique, if you don't quite get something, the reason is probably that I missed that bit out. Also, prior to starting a presentation, you should make sure your title slide is up. I got into sports biomechanics almost 60 years ago by posing the following question to myself. If someone is doing a plain somersault without twist, is it possible for them to start a twist after takeoff? And if so, how? Some years later, I discovered the answer, or at least part of the answer. The top sequence may be thought of as a plain jump without the vertical movement. The body is in a slightly forward flexed position to start with, although you can't see it here, but by the fourth graphic from the left, the body is in a side arch over the right hip. In fact, the body looks slightly tilted from this frontal view. However, in a plain jump, once the body straightens out, there's very little tilt and very little twist. However, when exactly the same movements are used in a somersault, then the body stays tilted and starts twisting. So the following sequence, generated by simulation, was aimed at helping people to learn how to twist after takeoff in a somersault. So you can see the hip movement there with wide arms. And once the arms are brought close to the body, we get 1.5 twists instead half a twist. And the same kind of thing happens in a double somersault. This progression was used by a former world trampoline champion to learn how to twist with straight arms. Next, watch the arm action of this young man on his hop, step and jump. This is the current world record, I think. It's been around for more than 30 years. We did a simulation study. In the top sequence, we have an actual performance, and the arm action is asymmetrical, whereas in the optimized performance, the optimization routine figured out the best performance and came up with the same answer as Jonathan Edwards, that we have both arms moving forwards and up together at the same time. So if Jonathan Edwards hadn't beaten us to the punch, we could have said what the best method is originally. If we look at repeated giant circles, we can look at the shoulder and hip angles and see what variability there is. And we find that there's very little variability of the timing of changes at the hip and shoulder near the lowest point, because at the lowest point energy is pumped into the system, so it's mechanically important. At the highest point, the gymnast makes adjustments to keep the rhythm of consecutive giant circles going. So every giant circle is slightly different, and every adjustment is slightly different. Here we have a recatch movement on high bar, and the idea was to work out how much opportunity there is to recatch and how good the gymnast was at recatching. One result was that this gymnast wasn't very good at recatching. We had to do 60 trials before we got 10 caught. So we find out that so long as it was within 12 milliseconds, he could recatch. Here we have the Felter handstand on P bars. And if Bill Gates' technology will allow us, we can see it again. This is a Feldjaw under somersault to handstand. In this research, we wanted to find out what was the best technique. And simulation showed us that there were two best techniques, which were both currently in use. The top one, which is called the deep pike technique, gives greater vertical velocity and can be the basis for learning more difficult skills. The lower sequence, called the hips close to the bar technique, requires less flexibility and less strength or less effort, and is suitable for junior gymnasts learning the movement. Finally, what is a limiting sports movement? A limiting sports movement may be defined as one which is only just possible or is not quite possible. So, in a reverse twisting 1.5 somersault, the question is, how many twists are possible? And this is the answer. If you take no twist from the board and move both arms through 90 degrees one way, then 180 degrees the other way, whilst flexing over one hip, and then hold a straight position with one arm bent over the head and the other arm over the chest, and finally make some movements to stop the twist and enter the water correctly, we get the following simulation. The splash was added by Michael Hiley as a joke. Viewing this from the front, you can see that it's aerial twist because it's possible to stop the twist and enter the water without any tilt. Finally, these people deserve more than a mention for their help in putting this presentation together, but that's all they're going to get.